So this is part 2 of a 4-part series dedicated to the victims of the Frankston serial killer. If you missed part 1, that's linked below, so I would go and watch that first, otherwise let's get straight into it. So nearly 1 month after Elizabeth Stevens was murdered, there was another attack. On the 8th of July 1993, Rosa Toss, a 41-year-old woman, was working her usual shift at a bank in Cheltenham. She finished up her shift at 5 p.m. and headed to the train station where she caught the train from Cheltenham to Seaford. By the time she got to Seaford, it was quite dark. Rosa started walking to her house, but she noticed that there was a man standing near the toilet block. She looked at him but tried not to think too much of it and then continued walking down Railway Parade. It was quite busy in the area at the time as everyone was heading home from work. But despite this, all of a sudden, Rosa felt someone grab her around the chest. She turned around and noticed that it was the man that had been standing at the toilet block. The man then grabbed hold of Rosa's hair and used it to pull her towards the toilet. He then pushed her so hard that they both actually fell to the ground. Rosa couldn't believe what was happening to her and she just wanted to get away from this man. Willing to do anything, she offered the man the expensive ring on her finger, but he completely ignored this offer and said nothing. Instead, he came at Rosa again and pushed her on her back. Rosa screamed, hoping someone would hear her and come and help her. This man put his hand over Rosa's mouth and she actually bit him, which caused him to pull away. The man then told Rosa not to scream as he had a gun in his possession. He placed something hard against Rosa's head as if to resemble a gun, but Rosa thought that the object didn't really feel like a gun, so she thought he must have been bluffing. In a bid to save her life, Rosa used all her strength to push this man off her. She got up and then started running to the road in hopes that she could get someone to help her. But her hopes were short-lived when she took a couple of steps and felt the man grab her hair again and pull her back to the ground. Rosa found herself fighting against the man yet again and actually managed to bite his finger for a second time. She pushed him off her and this time managed to escape him. She ran towards the road and ran in front of a car trying to get someone to stop, and luckily someone did. It was a woman called Michaela and she comforted Rosa and got her into the car quickly. The man who attacked Rosa had seemingly disappeared. Rosa got into Michaela's car and she noticed that one of her shoes was missing, so she looked over to the reserve and it was lying on the floor. Michaela offered to get the shoe for Rosa, but Rosa actually got out of the car and got it herself. That is just so crazy to me that this woman was brave enough to get out and go and get it. I would have just left it behind. Michaela dropped Rosa home and when she got there, she phoned the police to report the attack. The police went to the reserve to see if they could find the perpetrator, but there was no one there. After checking the area, they decided to go to Rosa's home to speak with her. She described the man who attacked her as between 18 and 20 years old. He had a round face, blue eyes, and was wearing a beanie and a black jacket. Rosa told police that she had offered her attacker her expensive ring and the man didn't take it. This was quite alarming as it eliminates the possibility that this man was after money and indicated that he instead wanted to attack her for a more sinister reason. The police then returned to the station and put out all the relevant alerts regarding the attack. And that's where Rosa's story ends in this case. The woman's bravery to fight back saved her life. She did all the right things, including contacting police and officially reporting the attack, hoping to prevent this from happening to someone else. But despite this attack being reported, there was another attack that night, and this is where we move on to the story of Debbie Fream. So Debbie Fream grew up in a small country town called Casserton, which was about 360 kilometers west of Melbourne. She had met her boyfriend there, Gary, but life in the country came with huge unemployment issues and Debbie found it difficult to find a job. One of her really close friends, Jeanette, had actually moved to Melbourne, so Debbie decided she wanted to move too. She was hoping that if she moved away from the country town, her boyfriend Gary would follow too. There was also a group of people in the town that was a bad influence on Gary, so Debbie really wanted him to move away from that also. And lucky for Debbie, Gary did follow her. The couple moved into a home on Cannonook Avenue in Seaford. Debbie started a new job, but shortly after, she actually discovered she was pregnant. Debbie worked through most of her pregnancy before eventually resigning to await the birth of her first baby. At the end of June 1993, Debbie gave birth to a baby boy who she called Jake in Frankston Hospital. Gary was extremely supportive after Jake was born and Debbie was very happy. But then that fateful day came along and ruined everything. On the 8th of July 1993, Gary had slept in because he had work late that day. Debbie woke up every 4 hours to feed baby Jake. She was a bit tired, but she wasn't complaining. Just after 1 p.m, Gary left for work. Debbie followed him out onto the front porch with baby Jake in her arms and said goodbye, telling Gary that she would see him after work. Once Gary was gone, Debbie's friend Jeanette came to the house at around 2 p.m. Debbie breastfed Jake, and as soon as she was finished, her and Jeanette went shopping. They also made a stop at Jeanette's mum's house so she could see baby Jake. That evening, Debbie invited her friend Russell Hayes over for dinner to catch up and to meet her new baby, who was just 12 days old. Russell was someone Debbie had met at work, and the two were really good friends. Gary, Debbie's boyfriend, would have joined them for dinner, but he was going to be stuck back at work late that night, so it was just Debbie and Russell. When Russell arrived at the house, house, Debbie was in a really good mood. She told Russell that before she gave birth to Jake, everyone said that her life was going to change so much and it was going to be really difficult. But she actually found it really easy and enjoyable, and she loved being a mother. While Debbie was making dinner, she realized she didn't have any milk and needed some. She asked Russell if he could watch Jake while she drove down to the shops quickly to go and grab some. It was only a couple of minutes down the road and Jake was actually asleep. Debbie grabbed her keys and her purse and left the house in her Nissan Pulsar at around 7 p.m. When Debbie left, Russell sat down to watch TV for a couple of minutes to keep himself occupied. But before he knew it, 30 minutes had passed and Debbie still hadn't returned. He started to get really concerned and walked outside to the end of the driveway to see if he could see any signs of Debbie, but there was none. He wasn't too sure what to do as he couldn't leave the house because Jake was asleep, and even if he did leave the house, he was unfamiliar with Seaford, so he didn't know which shops Debbie would have gone to. So what happened to Debbie that night? She had made it to the milk bar and she'd gone in and bought her milk and came back to her car. She hopped in the driver's seat and put the car into gear. She went to do a U-turn to head back home, but as she was doing this, she noticed a man in the backseat of her car next to her son's baby seat. This scared her, and as a result, she accidentally drove her car into the wall of the milk bar. Her car hit the wall so hard it put a dent in her bonnet. The man told her that she had to shut up and not give off any signs to anyone, otherwise he would blow her head off and decorate the car with her brains. He held a gun up to her, which was actually fake, but obviously Debbie didn't know this. He told her that she had to drive, and he actually made her drive up Cananook Avenue, which was right past Debbie's house. She literally drove past her own house where her baby was while being held at gunpoint. They drove to Taylor's Road when the man told Debbie to stop the car. Debbie told the man to take all the money she had as well as the car, but the man didn't want either of those things. He made Debbie get out of the car and then he pulled a cord out of his pocket. The man then wrapped the cord around Debbie's neck. Debbie was fighting for her life for a full 5 minutes with the cord tightly wrapped around her neck. But then she started to become weak and stopped struggling as much. The man then pulled a knife out of his sock and started stabbing Debbie in her neck and chest repeatedly. Debbie fell to the ground, then the man stabbed her in the throat multiple times as well as her stomach. He then dragged her body into some trees on the fence line and covered her body with branches. The man then got into Debbie's car and drove off, leaving Debbie's lifeless body on the side of the road. He parked her car at the New Life Christian Center, wiped down the car with his jumper to avoid leaving any fingerprints, and then he walked home. When he got home, the man put his clothes in the wash and then called his girlfriend and told her that he would meet her at Cananook railway station after she finished work. Now let's go back to what was happening at Debbie's house after she left to go get milk. So after the first hour passed and Debbie hadn't returned, Russell started to really stress. He called the Frankston police station and asked if any accidents had been reported in the area, but they didn't know of any. He then phoned Frankston Hospital and asked them if anyone by the name of Debbie Fream had arrived, but the hospital hadn't seen her and there was no unidentified accident victims there either. After exhausting all these options, Russell decided to phone Debbie's boyfriend Gary at work. Gary suggested that Russell ring one of Debbie's friends, Jeanette, who lived close by. Jeanette came over straight away and Gary left home early to head home. They drove around the streets looking for Debbie, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Then Gary and Russell decided to go to the Frankston police station to report Debbie missing. By the time the pair returned home after reporting Debbie missing, it was nearly midnight and Debbie still wasn't home. Gary stayed up all night waiting for Debbie, but she never returned. The next morning, police continued to search for Debbie, and they started to wonder if there was a connection between the attack of Rosa Toss at Seaford railway station at 6 p.m. the night before and the disappearance of Debbie Fream an hour later at 7 p.m. This case was quite alarming to officers. Debbie was missing, her car had not been located anywhere, and she had left her 12-day-old baby at home in the middle of cooking dinner for a friend. The possibility that Debbie left willingly seemed extremely unlikely. One of the officers who interviewed Gary earlier was driving back to the police station when he drove past the New Life Christian Center just off Frankston Dandenong Road when he noticed a grey Pulsar parked outside. He thought it might have been Debbie's car, so he did a U-turn and headed to the car. When he pulled up, he noticed that the registration on the car matched the registration Gary had told him earlier. This was Debbie Fream's car. The front passenger side door was unlocked and there was a dent in the front bonnet. He also noticed that the front driver's seat was pushed all the way back, so it appeared someone tall must have driven the car last. However, Debbie was quite short. Forensic examiners found traces of blood inside the car and the car was taken away as evidence. Then on the 12th of July 1993, 4 days after Debbie went missing, a man called Fred Michael Moore was working on his property in Carrum Downs. The property was only a short drive from residential areas, however it did feel like the middle of nowhere. After lunch that day, Fred had to move 10 horses from beside the house to a paddock alongside Taylor's Road. He rode his motorbike along the fence boundary and noticed what looked to be a pile of rubbish on the side of Taylor's Road. He rode past the rubbish, but it didn't seem right, so he went back to investigate. It looked to him like a shop mannequin lying in ferns. He thought that one of his neighbors was just playing a joke on him. But as he moved closer to it, he realized that it wasn't a mannequin, and it was actually the body of a woman. Fred rode back to the house and phoned the police to report the finding. Police went to the site and they confirmed that the body was that of young mum Debbie Fream. One of the detectives then went to Debbie's home to inform Gary, relatives and friends that after 4 days they had found Debbie's body. This was extremely confronting for everyone, and I can't even imagine how this would have felt. Investigators collected as much evidence as they could from the scene before her body was taken for a post-mortem examination. The next morning, the post-mortem was done by the same man who did the post-mortem on Elizabeth Stevens 1 month earlier. The examiner confirmed that Debbie had a total of 24 stab wounds caused by a large knife. Most of the wounds were on her neck, but she also had wounds on her head, chest and arms. She had been stabbed in the stomach also, but this occurred after death. She had 28 abrasions on her face, and she also had wounds on her back which were caused by a smaller weapon. There was also stab wounds on her hands, which indicated that she had fought for her life. One thing that is a bit graphic is she had cut wounds in between the webbings of her fingers. This suggested that she had tried to grab the knife away from her attacker. The examiner concluded that in his opinion, Debbie's cause of death was aspiration of blood and hemorrhage from multiple stab wounds to the neck in a woman who had an episode of ligature strangulation. One thing police couldn't ignore were the similarities between Debbie Fream's murder and the murder of Elizabeth Stevens 1 month earlier. Both women had been murdered at night, both had been strangled and stabbed, neither woman had been sexually assaulted, and both bodies had been dumped in a secluded location. They had also been murdered within a short distance of each other. Investigators were worried that if both murders were really connected, then the killer may strike again. With serial killers, it is common that the cooling down periods between each murder shorten as the desire to kill gets stronger. So if there was another murder, there was a chance that it would happen in less than a month. And that's where we leave Debbie's case for now, but we will discuss it again when we identify the killer. Part 3 is linked below, where we talk about what happened to the last victim, 17-year-old Natalie Russell.